Ministry of Finance, the Chief Economic Advisor, the presidents of the different chambers, captains of the industry, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. I think in India the budget has now become more than a usual accounting ritual, because it indicates the policy direction in which the government wants to move. And therefore it's quite obvious that the budget is both preceded and succeeded by various opinions, discussions. And I think probably the most difficult job is of the finance minister, the easiest being of the commentators, who all feel that the global situation is terrible and therefore the budget should create firewalls to protect India from those global trends. The budget must aim at spending more. It must also aim at collecting less taxes and still maintain the fiscal deficit. Well, it's the job of these commentators and columnists which I think is now becoming the most envious as far as I am concerned. Well, this budget was prepared with the very active participation of all my colleagues who are present on the dais here and many others in their respective departments. I must record my appreciation for all the hard work done over the last few months by each one of them. We were conscious of the global situation. Many parts of it are not very helpful. The exports have shrunk. There is an increased amount of volatility which impacts on our markets, it impacts on our currency. And therefore, to assume that we could be disconnected from the global situation would be erroneous. And faced with this challenging global situation, which was not exactly helpful, we spent the last 1 year steering the economy in somewhat very difficult and challenging circumstances. And I think what is most significant about the current year, which is about to end this month, that we kept to our discipline, and after several years we've come across a year where our actual developmental expenditure will exceed the budgetary estimates. The UPA system of accounting was different. The budgets used to provide for a high expenditure, and then at the end of the year you cut down on several expenditures. Obviously you can't cut down on revenue expenditure. Salaries and pensions have to be paid, interest payments have to be made, you have to spend on defense. So what you eventually ended up cutting used to be the developmental expenditures. As a result of which, towards the end of the tenure, the growth started itself suffering. Fiscal deficit could be maintained either by earning more or by spending less. And therefore, it was met in the past years by spending less. I think the current year is a very significant departure. We collected more and we spent more. And therefore, we exceeded the budgetary estimates itself. And that is why public spending became a very important contributor as far as growth is concerned. Now, faced with the situation, the services sector is doing well, manufacturing is somewhat picking up, but you need a boost on infrastructure. What is it that the economy actually needed? You've had 2 terrible years of less than normal monsoon. You have an agrarian sector in distress. You had reduced spending. And therefore, on basic first principles, you had to help those sectors where the gaps did exist. And the obvious gaps were in the agricultural sector and in rural India. And therefore, the first priority of the government was that the basic thrust of our expenditure must come in those sectors. The Rural Roads Program is extremely helpful and also very popular. Almost every rupee that you provide for it gets spent. In the last 2 years of the UPA, you had about 8,000 and 9,000 crores sanctioned. Last year we sanctioned more. But then after the increased allocation to the states, after the 14th Finance Commission, it was decided by a committee of the chief ministers that the states would now share on a basis of 40% the states would share and 60% the centre would give. So this year the combined total of about 27,000 crores is almost 3 times the amount being spent on rural roads. Now the sectoral stroll around was also visible when we took over the government in the national highways. It was almost a paralyzed sector. It was conceived as probably one of the most successful programs because it started on the strength of the cess. And by 2013-14, the national highways was a paralyzed sector. There was no dispute settlement mechanism. Those who built the highways, their projects had become non-bankable. They were almost bordering on bankruptcy. The banks were not supporting them. And we were amazed that the first few tenders which were taken out by the highway authority didn't attract a single response. There was nobody left in the country who could build highways. That was the condition of an important segment which we inherited. And therefore last year the emphasis was on putting a lot of public money into the highway sector itself. And this year we've kept up that momentum. And therefore between the highways, the rural roads and the railways, there's a huge amount of an infrastructure spend that we have concentrated on. Additionally, new ports envisaged with on a corporatized structure, predominant participation of the private sector itself. New airports. In fact, to boost regional connectivity, the policy is being formulated by the Civil Aviation Department. And in the meanwhile, I have announced that a large number of strips which are owned by the state governments would be developed in jointly by the centre and the state. Not all of them, but wherever it's needed. And there are still 25 unused strips of the airport authority. So the first 10 of them will be developed into smaller airports. So you will have more airports in the regional areas, you will have some more corporatized ports, more highways. Today I read a statement, the highway minister has announced that he is going to apply for a soft loan from the LIC just as the railways has the facility available in order to further add to that sector. So there is a lot of emphasis both on the rural sector spending as also on the infrastructure. And in the rural sector, again, the Manrega, you sanction 40,000 crores and end up spending only 25,000 or 26,000 at the end of the year. So you get an applause when you sanction 40,000, but at the end of the year, nobody notices that the amount spent was much less. Last year, whatever we allocated was spent. This year, if we are able to spend the entire allocation, it will be the highest ever spending on Manrega because that's where you need to improve upon the rural wages. if you are to reach the target of a very difficult target of doubling the rural wages itself or the rural incomes. Therefore, the roads, the irrigation program, the Swachh Bharat campaign in the villages, the entire spending as far as various aspects of rural India are concerned, I think this is a very important segment which the budget has concentrated on. Additionally, I think it was extremely important also to continue with the social security programs. As economies develop, the society increasingly provides a social security. Therefore, our first emphasis in the first year was to connect people to bank accounts. Thereafter, we said our intention is to make India a pensioned and an insured society. So last year we came out with those low-cost insurance policies and the pension scheme for weaker sections. This year the Prime Minister has already announced the crop insurance scheme, hugely supported by the state, because that also helps the agricultural sector when it's in distress. Additionally, the health scheme for the vulnerable sections of society. And I think this will boost the health sector considerably, because a state support, the scheme has two aspects. The first aspect, the details are being worked out, is only for senior citizens belonging to the BPL category. Now the corpus from this comes from a budgetary proposal last year by which I had a law cleared by Parliament, where we subsumed all the unclaimed amounts lying in the government. So that has been diverted under various schemes towards this health scheme for senior citizens. They get an additional benefit of 30,000 rupees, and then a family gets a benefit of about 1 lakh insurance. So you will have any hospital in the state sector or the private sector which they can avail of. So it's a great facility which weaker sections of the country will have. I think it's the most ambitious health scheme which has ever been launched. Now on targeting of subsidies, which is probably one of the most important reform measures as far as this government has announced and actually implemented in many areas, the impact of this, particularly the Give It Up campaign, has been that 75 lakh people have given up their subsidies on the LPG cooking gas. Many more are going to do so. There is a particular income group which has been disentitled as far as this subsidy is concerned. Using the DBT methodology, a lot of savings have been effected. Now that is being partly used for the benefit of the weaker section. So the bottom layer of 5 crore families over the next 3 years, their first connection is provided to them substantially at the government cost. And that not only helps them in terms of healthcare or in terms of environment, but also into the mainstream brings those segments of society. These are the welfare schemes which the budget itself has announced. I think if we look at the various other economic reform measures, and this is of particular interest to those who analyze budgets in terms of left versus right. In order to boost the economy, we already have two important legislations which are still pending in Parliament, the GST and the bankruptcy and insolvency law. Now, there are important steps which have been announced in this regard as far as the budget is concerned. Giving a statutory backing to Aadhaar and making it mandatory for those who want the benefit of any form of government subsidy or advantage. And therefore, wherever the funds of the government or the state governments comes in, they can make it necessary for you or compulsory for you to have this identification, because the same man doesn't claim the benefit 5 times over and the most deserving family gets the benefit. I think this is a very significant reform. There are a series of capital market related and FDI reforms, I think the most significant being that agricultural produce produced in India and products manufactured in India out of that, we have allowed 100% FDI in them. So that the wastage as far as the agriculture is concerned, this will improve the quality of food available, and most importantly, this will help the farmer itself because his produce doesn't go waste. I think one of the reforms which has gone relatively unnoticed, and that relates to the most unreformed segment of the Indian economy, which is the state transport. You have cities after cities which don't have a structured transport system. And therefore, I have proposed using entry 35 of list 3, which is a concurrent list subject, that we'll have the enabling central legislation and the amendments to the Motor Vehicles Act, which completely frees up this sector from this quota permit Raj which exists in the states. And therefore, people will be entitled to put in there more buses, more competition, better facilities as far as consumers are concerned. And I think a lot of, it will also address unemployment issues as far as the states itself are concerned. The listing of the GIC companies, the pilot project for the fertilizer DBT being used in certain districts, the gas exploration, the deep sea gas exploration on a market discovered price based on certain principles, the resolution of disputes in relation to infrastructural projects. I think these are very significant structural reforms which have been announced in this budget, which go on to help the Indian economy itself. Taxation simplification. And I think in this whole process, some of the simplifications which have been brought about are extremely important. We have, for a very large section of taxpayers, small traders, small workshop owners, professionals, and covering an overwhelming majority of these segments, moved on to presumptive taxation. Now, presumptive taxation itself will make assessments easier, will make filing of returns easier, it will dispense with the need to maintain books of accounts, and therefore a very large percentage of India's taxpayers will now be within the sphere of presumptive taxation, presumptive income on which they pay taxes rather than get into this whole complicated exercises. In the last 3 budgets, we've been systematically announcing reforms which help the small taxpayer. I had in the first time upped the limits as far as the exemption is concerned. Some investment limits were also increased. Investments in the housing sector, we had increased it. This time we've given a great boost to the low-cost housing segment. Additionally, this time, this whole idea of presumptive taxation, both in procedure and in quantum, helps the small and medium taxpayer significantly. Additionally, as far as the small and medium is concerned, there were some transportation expenses relief we had given last year. There is some relief to the tenants that we've given this year. And I think what is most important is our desire to resolve all pending disputes. Income which has escaped assessment, we've opened a compliance window. You pay higher. It's not an amenity scheme because you'll have to pay 50% more than the normal tax. In amnesty, you just pay tax and get away with it. And you'll have to pay it at the current values, not at some old assumed value. Resolution of disputes. So at the first appellate stage, both in direct and indirect tax, you can have your disputes resolved by paying the tax plus interest in some cases, penalty in some very exceptional high value cases. Even in retrospective tax, which is a legacy I have inherited from the past, I've again taken one step forward. I had hoped that it would be resolved by the courts or tribunal where the issues are pending. But now I have a statutory mechanism of resolving it. And therefore, again, we've taken the first significant step forward in order to be in a position to resolve this. Banking was a stress sector. And therefore, professionalizing public sector banks, recapitalizing the banks. The Reserve Bank has last evening taken a very positive move, which helps further in the recapitalization of the banks itself. And therefore, whatever resources are required to keep the public sector banks in good health, we are going to take. We are also, after improving upon their health, going to look at possible consolidation and further reforms. And while doing so, I have had also a fiscal discipline to maintain. And at a time where the private sector has been somewhat conservative in its investments, public investments during such periods always takes the lead. I'm conscious of that. And therefore, while improving upon the public investments, creating an environment for both global and domestic investments to move up, and yet maintaining fiscal discipline, which was extremely important, because we can't claim to be the fastest growing major economy in the world, oil prices being what they are, and still be projected as an economy which can't maintain its discipline. And therefore, it was extremely important for us under these circumstances to maintain that discipline. And I'm quite sure, with all the steps we have taken, and hopefully if the next financial year is politically not as obstructive as the last one, we'll be able to push through many more reforms, and I am sure beat the target that Arvind has set in the economic survey itself. Thank you.